Neil Ferguson, Jonah Goldberg, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
It's our pleasure.
Starting with a royal we already. I like it.
Neil, your first piece for the Free Press as a columnist, "We're all Soviets now." Give us a kind of précis of what you mean by that and the kind of general argument that you're making.
Well, I had a prophetic vision of the first presidential debate of 2024. And part of the inspiration for the piece was that if your system can only produce senile men as potential leaders, you might be going a bit Soviet. So that was the starting point. And then another thing struck me, and that was that if you look at public health statistics, the deaths of despair phenomenon that Angus Deaton's written about, whereby there's been a deterioration in life expectancy in the US and mortality rates are rising for various different parts of the population. Deaton noticed that white, middle-aged, middle Americans had worsening mortality data. When you look at the most recent statistics, young American men actually have a higher mortality rate than young Russian men. So I started asking myself a very serious question, which is when anywhere has a relatively advanced economy experienced a decline in those indicators, a worsening of life expectancy and an increase in mortality rates. And there really is only one example, because no other advanced economy today has this trend. The United States is a complete outlier. And it hit me at the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union and post-Soviet Russia had a dramatic deterioration in life expectancy and a big surge, particularly in male mortality rates. And the problem there was people were drinking themselves to death. It was a kind of vodka binge, as opposed to, say, fentanyl. But I just was very struck by the fact that that's the only other case I can think of. And then the final point that kind of clinched it for me was when you ask why were Russians drinking and smoking themselves to death in the 1980s and 90s on such an amazing scale, the answer is they became completely demoralized by what was going on around them, and they became utterly cynical about the system within which they lived. And that was because the nomenclatura who ran the Soviet Union were the purveyors of an ideology nobody believed in. And I suddenly thought, you know what, that's kind of familiar, because I think the American equivalent of the nomenclatura, that people who run the American establishment, the donorocrats, as I like to call them, they are also now the purveyors of an ideology nobody believes in. And ordinary Americans feel completely alienated. So that when you look at the Gallup polling, there's been a collapse of confidence in pretty much every institution over the last 50 years, but especially in the last 20 years. And I connect these things so that I see a system that produces senile leaders, that produces declining quality of life and length of life, and produces an ideology everybody is kind of repelled by. That's why we're the Soviets now. And it's sort of, are we the baddies? Are we the Soviets? I think we are, to a greater extent than we want to face, a greater extent than Jonah wants to face, certainly.
Jonah, you responded to Neil's piece over at the Dispatch, and a very generous response, but a pretty serious disagreement. And you said, look, I agree with the numbers, these deaths and the kind of hideous nature of American politics in so many ways. But I have one large disagreement. We are not Soviet, and we're not becoming Soviet. Explain your disagreement with Neil's piece.
Yeah. So first of all, again, delighted to be here. I have, I guess I have two main objections. One is, if we're just going to use the word Soviet Union or Soviet as a stand-in for bad or things going wrong, then fine. I mean, I think there are a lot of better words we could choose. But if we're supposed to take the analogy seriously, as Neil seems to want to, both here and in his piece. I just think it's pretty ahistorical. I don't think, look, you can have a lot of diseases have similar symptoms. That doesn't mean the diseases are the same. And the sources of our problems, which I'm happy to concede, the sources of our problems are just very different than the sources of the problems for the Soviet Union. And the phrasing, are we the baddies, feels very New Left 1960s moral equivalent argument to me. The idea that somehow we're bad because we have these problems misses the moral component entirely, which is to say that the Soviet Union was an evil empire. We are not. Our problems come from, in many respects, an excess of freedom rather than a totalitarian control of freedom. And the historical roots of how we got to where we are versus how the Soviet Union got to where it was in the late 80s are just night and day different. I don't think there's a historical equivalence, and I certainly don't think that there's a moral equivalence. And I will say, just as a point of personal privilege, because this came up, Neil just did it again, and he did it in his Twitter response, the idea that, I mean, he sort of wants to have it both ways. He wants to offer a very provocative thesis, but then he says he's not doing it just to be provocative, that he actually means it. It's sort of a Trumpy kind of take him literally and seriously. I can do one or the other, but they require different responses. But the idea that I am the target audience that needs to be woken up out of my cope, as he put it, the idea that I've been complacent about the actual problems that Neil is delineating, I just don't think there's any evidence for that. I wrote a book called Suicide of the West, where I talked about many of the problems that the United States has. I've been complaining about debt and deficits for a very long time. My problem, I guess my third problem with this is I think a lot of the sources of our political dysfunction in America, on the right and the left, stem from an excess of catastrophism. I thought the Flight 93 essay was hot garbage and did serious damage to political discourse and intellectual discourse in this country. And when you tell people that the sky is falling, and that, Neil does not do this. I want to be clear. Neil's not saying that, like, we're one election away from oblivion or anything like that. But the people who want to make those arguments look to things like this and say, see, the whole system is corrupt. The post-liberals on the left and on the right want to say that the American experiment, the American project, is inherently corrupt, that is inherently flawed. Some on the intellectual right want to argue that it was wrong from the beginning. Start with the Enlightenment or the American founding. That's the sort of Patrick Deneen, Adrian Vermeule crowd. And arguments that say we are the baddies because we've got these problems takes the intentionality out of things, and I think misstates the source of the problems and gives permission structure to a set of solutions that would make everything worse.
Neil, there's a lot to respond to there. I want to start with a kind of top-level thing. Jonah points out, that, look, there are real problems here, and he wrote a book kind of sort of delineating those problems. But we're very different from the Soviet Union. You can't possibly be serious. He says in his response, sure, there's some overlap, but come on. That's what Jonah actually says in response. And it reminds me in some ways of the way people talk about Donald Trump. And they say, we're trundling towards fascism. But, I look at it and I say, good God, in the 1930s, late 30s, you had pitched street battles. People being killed by the SA and by the KPD's street battle. It's different. It's very, very different. Would you concede that point that, we are very different from the Soviet Union, and we're maybe suffering from an excess of freedom rather than an excess of government control?
Well, ordinary Americans don't think that they're suffering from an excess of freedom. Only people who went to Ivy League colleges think that. The polling's quite clear. I think what's missing in this discussion is that one can compare social and cultural pathologies while acknowledging that institutional differences are real. In the Soviet Union, they had one party. In the United States, the political system is a duopoly with two parties. But what I'm trying to get you to see, Jonah, is that if you allow for the fact that there are these structural differences, the outcomes for ordinary people, whether they're in Leningrad or San Francisco, are remarkably similar, where you get this curious combination of a crisis of public health and a crisis of public morale. What I'm trying to get you to see is that it can't be just coincidence that these are the only two cases. That if you could tell me about another advanced society where living standards declined, where mortality rates rose, where another society where 100,000 people a year die of overdoses, which is the United States today. There's no other society like that. What's going on here? That I can only think of one other example, and that's the Soviet Union. The answer is you're trapped in a kind of political institutional determinism. But if you're dying of an overdose, it doesn't matter if it's vodka or fentanyl, you're dead. You died young. You're a young man and you drank or drugged yourself to death. Why did you do that? One's living in the workers' paradise and one is living in the land of the free. The answer is that it's neither the workers' paradise, nor is the United States the land of the free. The truth is there's a disillusionment, a profound disillusionment amongst ordinary people in both cases, and a sense that they've been sold a bill of goods, that it's all a sham. You see, although you don't feel constrained, you feel free, and you think, I'm in a much better position than my counterparts in the Soviet Union, the ordinary people suffering premature death from overdoses are in a remarkably similar predicament, where they think this system is completely a sham, and it's simply not worth my living. So we've got to be able to say it doesn't necessarily matter whether one system claims to be the land of the free and the other is the workers' and peasants' state. If both are organised hypocrisies in which an elite gets to go to its Dashers stroke Hamptons villas while everybody else is suffering serious declines in their length and quality of life, that's important. And we ought to be able to compare social and cultural crises and consider the possibility that they might arise in very different systems, in radically different systems, that have one thing in common: the utter alienation of a large part of the population from the proclaimed purpose of the system. Can I add one other point? The other
Jonah,
point,
what do you make of that specific? Oh, you go ahead.
Well, I add one other point. My ulterior motive in making this argument is to help Americans adjust to the reality of Cold War II. And the problem we have here is that it's been very difficult to get Americans to realize that they're in Cold War II. I said this for the first time 6 years ago. And there's still quite high levels of denial going on. Things have improved, but it is still the official line of the Biden administration that we're not in a Cold War. And the thing that's really important about this argument is that as we are in a Cold War with an authentically authoritarian, totalitarian regime, we need to consider the possibility that we might lose. See, the defining characteristic of the Soviet Union, apart from its being a massive organised hypocrisy, is that it lost the Cold War. And it lost it partly because its morale collapsed. We have to consider the possibility that we could lose Cold War II because of the same inner collapse that robs ordinary Americans of the faith that they generally had in Cold War I.
Jonah, I don't think there was many people, save maybe Eric Hobsbawm and Beatrice Webb or something, who thought that the Soviet Union was a workers' paradise. But most people tend to say, well, it's imperfect, but this is the land of the free. Niall says no. I mean, in all of that response, what do you make of that one line that we are actually not the land of the free, and people have to understand that?
Yeah, I just generally reject it, soup to nuts. free speech in this country has never been more free than it is today. There is a tendency in maybe it's in Western culture generally, but definitely in America, to freak out about some of the things we have the least reason to freak out about. And I think free speech is one of those. This Supreme Court is the most pro-free speech Supreme Court in American history. And look, are there encroachments to freedom from the regulatory state, from the administrative state, from all sorts of areas? Is DEI gross and stupid? Sure. It's just not comparable to the organized, Bolshevism of the Soviet Union. I mean, this debate would not be allowed in the Soviet Union. I mean, that tells you something. So the distance between the Soviet Union and a worker's paradise, between the reality and the ideal, and the distance between the United States today and the ideal enshrined in the concept of the land of the free is not the same distance. We're short of our ideals. We're always going to be short of our ideals because that's why we call them ideals. There are things to strive for. There are the North Star. You can go towards them. You can get closer, but you're never going to reach them. But our proximity to our ideals when it comes to things like personal liberty and freedom is very close compared to the distance between the workers' paradise ideal and the reality of it in the Soviet Union. But Neil kind of gives away the point here in a little bit. He conceded these are radically different systems. That's part of my point. And if you're going to talk about radically different systems, leaning so heavily into the analogy of us being like the Soviet Union, I think is going to confuse more than it's going to illuminate. I think deaths of despair are a real problem. I don't know if there have been, other societies that had sudden drop-offs of life expectancy of the sort we've seen recently. I do know that, say,
I'm telling you that
okay, I'll take your word. I'll stipulate it. But I mean, I do know things like
and that's kind of,
Rome,
and I think that's quite a big deal. No, I said a relatively advanced.
I think it's a big deal. I just don't think it's proof that we're. Yeah,
so what are you telling me is happening here?
I agree. It's
100,000 Americans die every year, and that's just the overdoses. The mortality statistics for young American males are worse than for their Russian counterparts. And this is the land of the free. This is all going really well. Please, what's going on if it's not a crisis of morale?
I have not said everything's going really well. And I've conceded that the deaths of despair thing is a very significant thing to be concerned about.
So John, what's your explanation?
Despite the straw man kind of persona you want to impose upon me.
No, but what's your explanation?
So part of the explanation is that fentanyl is a very different thing than Soviet vodka. That fentanyl is in many ways a new and unprecedented threat, insofar as it's the only drug I'm aware of where it is actually, I for the longest time I couldn't figure out why fentanyl dealers didn't care about killing their own customers. And it turns out that it's a way to market your drug, because you tell the street that you have a fentanyl that can kill someone. It shows that it's pure and it's the good stuff. That is not what that was not the branding for tainted vodka. The shockingly cheapness, the shockingly inexpensive nature of the manufacture and distribution process of fentanyl makes it incredibly easy to flood into a society and flood into a market in a way that you couldn't do with opiates, which require vast amounts of agricultural space. You can do this in a basement in some rundown business in Tijuana and get enough that you don't care if half your shipments are intercepted because it's so cheap to make. My point is that when you actually get close to the ground and look at the nature of these problems, they don't, for me, say, aha, this means we're like the Soviet Union. It means no, this is a real problem and we should deal with it. But contending that this somehow makes us like the Soviet Union as a moral matter or as a historical matter, I just think is a level of abstraction and literary flourish that I don't think can be sustained by the sort of explanations and also the solutions that are required to deal with the facts on the ground.
Jonah, if you remove the Soviet comparison, do you kind of generally agree with Niall's premise that we're in a unique time? I mean, this being, I will also take his word for it. I can't think of any other example of, declining mortality rates and 100,000 people dying every year of drug overdoses. I mean, this is a sort of uniquely horrible time in American history, isn't it?
Well, it depends what you mean by uniquely. There are a lot of really bad things going on. There were a lot of really bad things going on in the 60s and 70s. There were some really bad things going on in the 1860s. In the United States, in a 18-month period, there were something like 5 domestic terror bombings a day in the United States. The head of the FBI in San Francisco said that San Francisco was the Belfast of North America. The crime rate in the New York City I grew up in blows away. I mean, I grew up in the neighborhood where Death Wish was filmed, right? I mean, crime is nowhere near the problem it was in my lifetime. And so there are always going to be things about contemporary society in a free society, and we are a free society, that one could point to and say, it's all going to shit. So that doesn't mean that at any given point is a time for despair. I'm with Ronald Reagan on this. Every generation's got to fight to maintain, freedom, because we're not born with it in our blood. It's a generational torch that you pass on from one generation to another. But there is so much catastrophism and so much doom scrolling in the culture that wants to say that things have never been worse. And you can pick the data sets, like in this case, life expectancy, and say, see, things have never been worse. But there's a lot of economics in Niall's essay, in which he now doesn't say his essay's primarily about economics, because I think in part, there's so many reasons to say that we are not economically like the Soviet Union. And just one last point, I am not the Davos guy here. I am not the Hamptons guy here. I don't live in some cocoon. But the idea that somehow there are just Morlocks and Eloys in this culture, and it's the people who are parasitically living off the wealth of this country and the nomenclature and the nomenclatura, and then everyone else is dying from deaths of despair, is just not true. In his piece, he concedes that a lot of this stuff is concentrated in certain areas, in certain demographics, and that means it's a discrete but very serious problem. It is not, I don't believe, the case that once you get outside the DC Washington, DC New York Acela corridor, that it's Mad Max territory out there. I just don't think there's data to prove that. I don't think there's data to prove that our standard of living is anything that conjures anything like comparisons to the Soviet Union. And so again, I agree with him about a lot of things. And on the Cold War II thing, I agree very much that we are entering a Cold War, and I think Niall deserves credit for being one of the first to point it out. I don't think it's necessarily a replay of the last Cold War. I'm not saying that he does. It's got differences and similarities, because Cold Wars are going to have differences and similarities. But there's a lot of cosplay on the American right that just wants to say, we're just doing the whole thing over again, but we're going to cast the Soviets as the Chinese. And I think that is going to misidentify the threats from China, and it's going to misidentify the resources that the United States has.
I'm recording this from the Hamptons, so I'm very angry about these disparaging comments about where I am geographically right now. Niall, a lot to respond to in there.
Well, I think what's amazing to me is the difficulty of persuading Jonah that you really need to take life expectancy and mortality rates seriously. You see, the argument, oh, well, things were really bad when I was growing up in New York, would be compelling if there were any evidence in the aggregate national data that things were getting worse, but they weren't. Throughout American history, until very recently, life expectancy just kept going up like it did everywhere else in the developed world. But what's amazing is that it has deteriorated so steeply in the last 20 years, and especially in the last decade, particularly for the bottom quintile of the income distribution. So much so that it shows up in aggregate national data. Now, nobody's dying prematurely in the Hamptons. In fact, for most Americans, this isn't palpable. But if you're in the bottom quintile of the income distribution, Jonah, your life expectancy is way worse than your counterparts in the other developed countries. The most disadvantaged people in Japan and Switzerland live to be 60. Guess what age they live to on average in the US? 41. Infant mortality for the bottom quintile, particularly with single parents, is almost emerging market developing country level, almost Soviet level, actually. And so we have to stop pretending, oh, it's been bad in the past. No, American life expectancy, mortality rates all trended better for most of American history until recently. And what I struggle to convey to people is that if something is so bad that it shows up in the aggregate data and it's not happening anywhere else, and the only other example that you can find is the Soviet Union in the 1980s and Russia in the 1990s, there's something important here that we can't just dismiss it by saying, oh, you're doom scrolling. No, people are dying way, way too young in America. That isn't doom scrolling. Angus Deaton wasn't doom scrolling. He was looking at the data, and the data are truly appalling. And only the Soviet Union has matched this in all of modernity. So I don't think you're taking this seriously enough, Jonah. You're not. You're not recognizing that it's an absolutely outrageous state of affairs that the quality of life of the people in the bottom quintile of the distribution is so bad that it now resembles late Soviet Russia.
Yeah. So, I understand, as sort of an Oxbridge debater type, I understand kind of what you're doing here. The idea that somehow I am, first of all, rejecting the importance of this problem when I keep saying I think it's a real problem is kind of weird. But I happy to stipulate this is a huge and important and legitimate problem that deserves our attention. Your essay wasn't because of the plight of the bottom quintile in the United States. In terms of deaths of despair, we are now like the Soviet Union. Your essay was about our economics. Your essay was about our Soviet justice system. Your essay was about a whole bunch of things. And as I pointed out in my response, I think you make a lot of good points. And but you treat this thing like it's a Christmas tree, and you hang a lot more less persuasive points on it as well, side by side, and think people won't notice the difference. So I'm perfectly happy to say again, this, as a matter of symptoms, that we have a similarity with the Soviet Union in terms of deaths of despair. The causes of these things are just, I think you have not demonstrated that they have the same root causes, that they would, and therefore would require the same sorts of solutions. Nor do I think that they get to the fundamental indictment of the Soviet Union as on a moral scale, on a philosophical scale, on an economic scale, that make the comparisons between us and them, I think, fairly spurious. And look, I mean, again, if you're going to just say that things going bad makes us like the Soviets, look, the British Empire failed and declined. That doesn't mean that it was like the Soviet Union. The Persian Empire failed and declined. It doesn't mean it was like the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union cannot be a metaphor for everything that goes bad in a country that is founded on completely different historical forces, intellectual concepts. I mean, go back to Werner Sombart. Why is there no socialism in America? Because we don't have a feudal past. I mean, the American exceptionalism is a deep and rich subject, and I think it still applies to metaphorical comparisons to the Soviet Union, even if I'm willing to concede all this stuff about the deaths of despair.
So Jonah, the thing that strikes me in this conversation is that we're talking not about the time of Werner Sombart, but the time that we live in now. And when you try to explain the deaths of despair, the best you could come up with was that fentanyl's really cheap. Vodka was really cheap in the Soviet Union. That's not why there were deaths of despair in 1980s and 1990s Russia. And you've got to come up with a better answer than you have so far for why America has totally deviated from the trend in all the other developed countries to the point that life expectancy's gone into reverse. Now, you're right. The essay then said, what else do we have in common with the Soviet Union? And I went through a list. We have a fiscal problem, which is the equivalent of the soft budget constraint that characterized the way the Soviet economy worked. And I think we have a problem in that there's a disconnect between the elite and the masses. And here's where I think you've missed something because you haven't been involved in the academic world the way I have. You say there can never be socialism in America. Well, that might have been true once, but if you
Werner
spent some
Sombart said
time,
it. I was just quoting.
yeah, right, you're quoting Sombart. But if you were to spend some time on the campus of a major university, you'd encounter something that wasn't quite socialism, but the identity politics and neoliberalism that now flourishes in all elite institutions in the name, the Orwellian name of diversity, equity, and inclusion, is an ideology that certainly has nothing whatsoever to do with your American ideals. In fact, when you ask the proponents of critical race theory for their accounts of American history, it is that American history is white supremacy. So I think one of the things that you miss in the essay, which is actually terribly important, is that the elites no longer believe a word you're saying about the American founding, the distinctiveness of the United States. They don't believe any of that. And that's part of my argument. The nomenclatura, the elites who staff Harvard and Yale and Stanford and the foundations and run the Democratic Party and will decide whether Joe Biden is viable as a candidate, those people are the nomenclatura. They are the elite. And they don't believe a word that you say about what makes the United States different from the Soviet Union. They would also say, in many ways, it is just another empire, probably a pretty evil one. Now, when you said just because the Soviet Union and the British Empire and other empires declined, that's got somehow nothing to do with the United States, you have to consider the possibility that the United States could also turn out to be a declining empire. I argued that in a book called Colossus 20 years ago. And very few of the things I said then are less true today. So I think you might be in denial about the pathologies, not only of American public health, but of the American political elite. And that's what, troubles me. There's a certain insouciance about your response, as if it'll all be fine. But it's not doom scrolling or catastrophizing to say, no, there's a moral crisis. There's a crisis of public morale and of public health. And the United States could conceivably lose Cold War II. I certainly would hate to see how US society would cope with a hot war with China these days if one were to break out this year or next year over Taiwan. How do you think we'd do? Do you think we'd win?
I don't think we'd lose in the long run. In the short run, I think I'm more concerned about not having
beat the Taliban.
Deterrence to prevent the conflict in the first place.
This country couldn't beat the Taliban, and you think we'll win against the PLA?
I get it.
Just saying.
Look, China.
It's not a good look.
China. China's got a lot of problems too. But yeah, look. Again, I have no problem. Look, also the idea that somehow I am wallowing in my crapulence of denial about the problems with the American left-wing elite is just crazy talk. If you could go back and read what I've written for the last 25 years about all of this stuff, it's just
read it, and I read your
Suicide of the West. And you think how many veins of ink I have emptied out criticizing people like Ibram Kendi and the campus nonsense and all of that kind of thing. It doesn't.
So don't you think they have anything to do with the Bolsheviks?
I think the perniciousness and the influence of Marxist nonsense is profound and serious, and I've been writing about it for a very long time. But
we're getting somewhere.
I think one of the
Marxism is in the system. The Marxism is in the system. Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah, but it doesn't run. It doesn't run the system. It doesn't. Really? The state is not controlled by really.
Really?
And for yeah, really. You think the equivalent of the Bolsheviks run the entire system, right?
I think the equivalent of the Bolsheviks control most of the key institutions in the country to an extent that's quite alarming.
I think there's a new class that controls a vast amount of the commanding heights of the culture, and I've written that a gazillion times. My point. So let me just back up for a second. The malaise stuff that you're talking about, again, is real. It's one of the things that's generating deaths of despair. You poo-poo my point about fentanyl, so let me broaden it out. Fentanyl's a new technology. Technology changes culture in ways that ideas don't, in a very sudden and serious way. a lot of the problems that we have in this country come from things like an epidemic of loneliness. And that is a result of new technologies that have come online in the last 20 years. Jonathan Haidt argument, which you cite in your piece. Those are very serious. They're very worrisome. There's also self-correction that's going on as we speak. Schools, the LA school district has just announced they're going to ban phones in schools. On college campuses, the nomenclatura that we're talking about here is pernicious and sinister, and I think that it would be wonderful if they were all purged. We are also seeing a natural correcting response from a lot of institutions in this country. The stuff that Robert George and his imitators across this country have been doing, the stuff that Ben Sass is doing at the University of Florida. My point is that if you think there's a pie-eyed optimism unreflected in what I've written and said for the last 25 years, by the way, in my response to you, I would say there's a certain amount of fatalism and bleakness and determinism in your position. You're not willing to countenance the fact that a lot of the bad things which we agree on are bad are being pushed back. Ibram Kendi is now a joke. Even according to the New York Times these days, schools are banning these mandatory DEI statements. Schools have reinstated the SAT just in the last few years. Are we back to a healthy, wonderful, elite campus culture? Absolutely not. We're reaping the fruit of a long march to the institutions by the kind of people that you and I both deplore. But this idea that somehow I'm blasé about all of these things, and the proof of my blaseness is that I reject your framing of this as to say we're replaying the mistakes of the Soviet Union, I just find wholly unpersuasive.
Niall, on that point about the DEI stuff and the institutions, particularly the universities, where, places that you inhabit, are we on the other side of that, as Jonah suggests? I mean, the Great Awakening, I think, really, that wave sort of crested in about 2020, but you see a lot of pushback on it now. I mean, are we going on that? I mean, not in the fentanyl deaths, but on that particular question, are we trending in a more positive direction now?
I'd love to believe it. I've been told over and over again that there's a wonderful pendulum that's going to swing back, at least to the centre. I've, of course, made my own efforts in moving it by creating the university in Austin, where we've created a constitution that enshrines academic freedom and meritocracy. But you've got to remember that the university landscape is still dominated by the Ivy League, by the colleges, and they change the presidents, but they don't really change much else. I haven't read about any diversity, equity, and inclusion officers being fired from Yale where they outnumber, or the bureaucrats outnumber the undergraduates. So I think we should be very careful about declaring victory prematurely. It's a bit of an American habit. In truth, the illiberal elite is institutionally very deeply entrenched, not only in the elite universities, which of course were where all the craziest protests in support of Hamas took place, but in the foundations, in the technology companies, in the publishing industry, and of course in Washington, D.C., in the federal bureaucracy. I'm much more concerned about that institutional capture, because I think it's so hard to undo. And indeed, what's striking to me is that Jonah conceded a moment ago that the illiberal ideology, that the derivatives of Marxism, at least, they really are a part of this story. I think if you try to come back to my original question, why is there this crisis of morale? Let's leave aside the public health question. Why do Americans have no faith in their own institutions? Like, what is public confidence in Congress, the elected representatives of the people, is like single digits, 8% last time I looked. It's really quite remarkable that in a democracy, the elected representatives of the people in the federal government are rated about where the Soviet population would have rated their counterparts in the Soviet system. Trust in institutions, if you average it out over all the Gallup polling data is about half what it was in 1979. And you and I, Jonah, are old enough to remember what morale was like in America in 79. That was the moment of malaise itself, that phrase that got that term that got associated with Jimmy Carter. But if we're in a situation where public confidence in institutions is half what it was at the end of the Carter presidency, that seems bad to me. And I struggle to find another way of capturing what's wrong. Because I don't think it's that easy to fix. I really, really disagree, Jonah, that we're winning this fight. I think it would be wonderful if Ben Sass and Robbie George and Pana Canelos, if those guys were kind of winning. I can assure you that's not really what's happening. What's happening is that Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Stanford are pretending to change their ways, and they're pretending to get rid of discrimination in admissions, racial discrimination in admissions. They're pretending, they're faking it, because people who run those institutions are deeply committed to an ideology that is as foreign to you and me as the ideology of Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko was back when we were young students. That's to me the critical point, and we underestimate at our peril the grip that these nomenclatura types have on American institutions. And we underestimate how demoralized that leaves ordinary Americans feeling, particularly if they're on the wrong end of the economic scale.
Yeah, so I'm a
and maybe we just agree.
Schumpeter.
Maybe we just agree.
And yeah.
And we're just coming at it with different terminology. But for me, the problem I have with your counter-argument is I'm not sure that I'm left with a plausible explanation of the problems that I see.
Okay, well, I'll try to offer one, which gets at my point about how we're not like the Soviet Union, even if we share some of the symptoms, right? Again, you could have dengue fever or malaria, different diseases, a lot of the same symptoms. A panic attack and a heart attack look similar, but they're caused by different things. I'm a Joseph Schumpeter guy, and Joseph Schumpeter, he basically has this prediction in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy that Western democracies are essentially that socialism is kind of inevitable because of the problem of wealth, not the problem of poverty, which is that the children or grandchildren of the big industrialists and the robber baron types, although I hate the phrase robber baron, they end up taking a sledgehammer to the very soapboxes that they stand on. They end up becoming part of the adversarial class. That's where the new class, this new class idea has lots of fathers, but that's part of it. And so you end up getting these sort of asshole trustafarian socialist grandkids of, the founders of Ford or Carnegie Mellon and all these kinds of, or Carnegie and that kind of thing. And you can see that kind of thing all over the place. These radicals who end up biting the hand that feeds them and disliking their own country because they are saturated in these academic environments that we both deplore with these adversarial anti-American ideologies. And this is partly I remember you once saying that you agreed a lot with Marx. You just took the side of the bourgeoisie in his analysis. I'm with you on this. But one of the problems with the bourgeoisie is the bourgeoisie get bored. The bourgeoisie start having, and boredom is one of the great threats to peace and prosperity. And, so it wasn't, as Deirdre McCloskey likes to say, it wasn't the coal workers and the car plant factory workers who were picking up the paving stones in 1968 and hurling them through windows. It was the petite bourgeois. It was the college students. It was the chief beneficiaries of Western wealth, and that's a real problem of figuring out a way to sort of curtail that sort of Nietzschean resentment from manifesting itself in our culture. And we see it all over the place. The impulse to shock the bourgeoisie, I think, informs an enormous amount of the asinine ideological culture of elite institutions. These people won the march through the institutions, but they don't actually want to run the institutions. They want to stay transgressive rebels. And so they're constantly undermining the narrative of the American experience and the American project. That's the Howard Zinn project to a T, is to say that all the good stuff in America is either invisible or was really actually bad. And what we see a lot of these jackass kids on college campuses living down to those ideals. But I will say, as bad as I did not, as you suggested, declare victory. I said that basically there are signs of improvement. I think that whether we've actually passed peak woke or not remains to be seen. But my point would be that democracies, and particularly the American democracy, which is now the oldest democracy in the world and is quite, was quite a stable one, have an enormous capacity for self-correction. Your guy, Adam Smith, he said there's a lot of ruin in a nation. A lot of things are always going bad, and America has this amazing capacity to sort of deal with them. It is not, what I think is pernicious is the idea to say, oh, we're on this inexorable teleological descent of decline like the American empire. People said that in the 1970s. We got a lot richer and stronger since the 1970s. We have the capacity to fix our problems, but it does take identifying our problems accurately. And just lastly, as bad as the DEI stuff and intersectionality stuff and all of that is, and I truly believe it's bad, it does not have the power to ruin people's lives the way the single party state apparatus of the Communist Party did. You can call Don. Oh, no, I should also point out, you're absolutely right. American elites, left-wing elites, are openly and shamefully hostile to the American experiment and the American story and American civilization generally. I agree with that entirely, and I'll bang my spoon on my high chair about it for the rest of my life. Stipulated. You know who else is? Donald Trump and his biggest superfans. Donald Trump rejected years ago the idea of American exceptionalism. He thinks constitutionalism is for suckers. He thinks essentially democratic norms and institutions are for suckers. And there are an enormous amount of weightlifting, bro, throne-sniffing goobers on the right who buy into all this stuff, telling each other, you know what time it is, and it's the Flight 93 stuff, and that, the Steve Bannon is the only person in this entire political context who matters, at least, who openly calls himself a Leninist. And so I think America has an enormous number of problems, but they are American problems, and they manifest themselves differently on left and right. I always rejected horseshoe theory for most of my life. I now believe it because I think the forces of illiberalism are very strong on the left, and now the right, big chunks of the right, have joined in on it. That's a big problem. It's not a Soviet problem.
As I said, in one system, one party, in the other, two parties, but in both cases, you're given choices between senile candidates for General Secretary or President. The debate last week felt like the clinching exhibit in my case. It's a different system, but somehow the net result is the same. And we don't actually have a candidate who's offering solutions to the problems that we agree are profound. That's what I find most disconcerting. And there's just no sign of a serious political debate about the public finances, about public health. The nomenclature of the political class is so completely irresponsible and indifferent to the fate of American people that they don't even attempt an inquiry into how pathetically badly they handled the COVID pandemic. At least their British counterparts attempted some kind of inquiry into why it was a fiasco. But the United States, which achieved the disruption of lockdowns without any discernible benefit in terms of excess mortality, has simply walked away from any serious inquest into what went wrong. I said in the piece, when you look at COVID, think Chernobyl. And there were Chernobyl-like features of the way that the United States handled the pandemic. In particular, the reluctance of the responsible officials ever to admit any responsibility for any of the things that went wrong. So, yes, I'm more pessimistic than you, Jonah. And that may just be a temperamental feature. I grew up in Scotland, which was where we pioneered hillbilly elegy. It's kind of like we did the pilot before J.D. Vance was even born. We decided, I don't know, let's just deindustrialize and see what happens. And I saw deaths of despair in Glasgow in the 1970s before I knew that that was what they were. And I saw the demoralization of the society in the west of Scotland in the 70s and 80s. And so when I went to Russia, I remember thinking, this does seem familiar. On the other hand, the piles of bodies seem larger here. And so when I went back and I kind of looked, I thought, well, is Scotland really the same story? And it's just doesn't come close. I mean, we just can't compete with Americans now when it comes to suicide. Now, we had a little digression earlier about fentanyl, but it's worth saying that fentanyl's only part of what's driving deaths of despair. When you break down the statistics, you've got about 500,000 suicides, which aren't fentanyl related. You got a ton of people who just shoot themselves. And of course, there's a massive alcoholism problem in the United States that's spread from males to females in recent years. So none of that is novel. I mean, let's not pretend deaths of despair are because fentanyl is new and cheap. Most of what's causing deaths of despair is actually just traditional ways of shortening your life. And I'm still struggling to understand why in a country that has, to the eyes of the rest of the world, the most successful economy, we're supposed to be kind of amazed by the vitality of the US economy, why are so many people killing themselves? I don't have a good answer to that question, except that there's some crisis of morale driving it. You mentioned Schumpeter. The key argument in capitalism, social and democracy is that capitalism has this self-liquidating character. And it's partly, he says, because the bureaucracy and academia are just full of people who quite quickly turn against capitalism and they look for the nearest hand that feeds them to bite. I think that's still compelling. You can see why he had the idea on the Harvard campus, but it still seems to be the case, and perhaps, and certainly on a much greater scale than in Schumpeter's time. So here's the thing that maybe is wrong with podcasts like this one. We're finding ways to disagree when we actually agree about most things. If all we're disagreeing about is how we characterize the pathologies, how we characterize the malaise, and I'm just saying, I don't think of anything like this except the Soviet Union. You're like, well, we're just not like the Soviet Union. That may be it. That may be all this boils down to. But what I'm struggling to hear from you is some better explanation of what's going wrong in the United States than that we are the Soviets now. And I want to frighten people, Jonah, because we are quite capable of losing Cold War II in quite a short time frame. That's what really drives me crazy. The sense that we do have agency, but we've just decided to kind of park it and hope that the pendulum does the swinging for us. I think we've got a massive crisis very imminently, geopolitically, technologically. We haven't talked about that much, but just socially and culturally. And the way I'm approaching this problem is to use "We Are the Soviets" to try and jolt people into realizing just how bad it is, while we still have time to self-correct. We're not, at this point, there is no real self-correction going on, and definitely not at the level of national politics, as we both agree.
Niall, you say that you probably agree on more things than you disagree on.
Sure.
Maybe find an area of agreement here, if I can. Because you said, watching the debate, there was no policy solutions from anyone to any of these problems. There was barely coherent sentences most of the time. But what are the policy solutions? I mean, the diagnosis, I can hear this from the Jacobin, from people on the far left and people on the populist right, making very similar arguments of what's wrong. But how does one solve this stuff? And I suspect maybe you and Jonah have some areas of agreement on this.
Well, I wrote a book, The Great Degeneration, about the same year Charles Murray wrote The Brilliant Coming Apart, which I thought was a prophetic work that understood better than almost any other book at that time where we were going. And The Great Degeneration says, here are the problems. We have a crisis of public finance that can't be solved without fundamental reform of this crazy, wasteful welfare state that has accumulated between the 1930s and the 1970s. We've got to address that. But we can't, that's not sufficient. A fiscal fix is not sufficient because there's also a problem of the administrative state with its pathologies of regulation and bureaucratization. The third thing that the book said was the rule of law has become the rule of lawyers. And we have this rent-seeking lawyer class who, of course, dominate the political system. And that's very far removed from the rule of law as it was originally envisioned in the English common law. And finally, we have a problem in education and more broadly in associational life that has caused the United States to cease to resemble the United States of Tocqueville's time and to resemble much more the France of today. I will say, if Tocqueville had a time machine and was able to come visit us, he'd look around the United States and say, so when did the French conquer you and impose their institutions on you, their centralization and all their other pathologies, their irrational Enlightenment professors? So I wrote that book 2011, I think, or 2012, and every single thing there has got worse since then. So that's my take. I'm waiting for some political leadership to attempt to reform these things. I think a lot of it will have to be done from the ground up in the red states. That's where there's some hope, which is why we're founding a university in Texas. But at the federal level, it's just woeful. You've got senile leadership and a massive fiscal crisis looming that at some point is going to hit this country very hard indeed, because trees don't go to the sky, and you don't have a debt burden this high in an atmosphere of high real rates without a fiscal crisis striking, and that's coming. That's coming soon. I mean, the deficit's so egregiously large, and they've pushed this economy to full employment by a massive fiscal stimulus. The reckoning is coming, and it will be very unpleasant. That's my take, Jonah.
Well, so there's a lot there I agree with, to be sure. I will note, again, it's very rare I get cast in the role of Pollyanna, but, just Friday, the Supreme Court threw out Chevron, which had been sort of a zombie case for a while, but it is sort of symbolically the heart of the administrative state problem that we got ourselves into, which is just another sign of self-correction.
Jonah, give me a kind of précis of what the Chevron case is in a couple of sentences.
Sure. If you read Charles Murray's wonderful book By the People, and Neil and I are both friends with Charles, the administrative state basically gets to work on essentially, there's a great book by Philip Hamburger called Is the Administrative Law Legal or Lawful? I have it up there. Unlawful. The basic idea is that wherever Congress is ambiguous in its statute writing, you have to defer to whatever the bureaucrats want to do. And shockingly, the bureaucrats have taken that to absurd lengths. And, the left wants to say, oh, this is going to be great for big business and big corporations. It's worth pointing out that the case that got Chevron overturned was about blue-collar fishermen in New England who were being asked to pay for bureaucrats to be on their boats at all times monitoring what they were doing. And they're like, this is crazy. This is not what Congress intended. So I think one of the sources for solutions in all of this, part of my broader thing, again, I think the Soviet prism misleads more than it directs. But if we're just going to talk about America's problems, I think one of our biggest problems is basically the advent of the primary system and the campaign finance laws that came in the 1990s have utterly gelded America's parties. We have strong partisanship in this country because the parties are so weak, not because they're too strong. Parties are supposed to be these mediating institutions that take the different and disparate interests of different members of their coalitions and force compromises on them for the benefit of the members of the coalition. And instead, they're essentially just branding opportunities for whatever cult of personality might take over at any given moment. The other part of the problem, I would argue, is that Congress does not do its job. Congress is supposed to be the place where political disagreements are adjudicated and hammered out, but instead, in part because of primaries, in part because of the television age, and now the internet, Congress is basically a parliament of pundits where they don't actually care about writing laws, and this fuels the cult of the presidency, which basically says we should just elect a king every 4 years. Obama was part of that problem, Biden is part of that problem, and Trump is part of that problem. They all represent this idea that somehow once the president is in there, they should just be able to do lawlessly whatever they want to do. And that's not the way our system works, and it's not the way our system can work. And so you get gridlock and dysfunction all over the place. I would, if we're talking about solutions, we could do this all day, but for starters, I would push as much power down to the most local level possible. Part of the problem, one of the reasons why there's malaise in this country, I think a lot of it has to do with technology. People are experiencing life through screens, which is not sufficient for human flourishing. People are self-medicalizing, all these kinds of things that are real problems. But I think that if you push power down to the most local level possible, that feeling that cold, unseen forces far away are controlling your life will seem less plausible. One of the advantages of subsidiarity or pluralism or localism or federalism, whatever you want to call it, is that you can fire the people responsible for the things that are screwed up in your life. When all of the power is concentrated among unelected bureaucrats, you feel like you have very little agency. So send as much power down to the most local level possible. Force people to actually be involved in democracy and in political contests rather than simply, give small donations to various gargoyles, whether they're Marjorie Taylor Greene or Ilhan Omar, and actually get back to the time when you had a sense that there was a certain expectation of involvement in your community that came with being a good citizen. Beyond that, look, I love to fire a lot of people in academia. I think the market is working in that direction, but it's a long way to go. I think Neil's right about that.
Is it a problem, Jonah, that the two parties have started to merge on economic issues? I mean, Republicans at least used to give lip service to free markets and things like that.
America has a populism problem, and it manifests itself in left-wing versions and right-wing versions. I think historians in the future will look back at presently the post-financial crisis moment, which we know from social science, financial crises of the sort we saw in 2007, 2008, and Neil knows far more about this than I do, tend to have long-tail populist reactions. And I think people are going to look back and they're going to see Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Parties, which for the standard denizens of a cable news studio seem like diametrically opposed things. And they're going to see them as two sides of the same coin about a reaction to the total screw-uppery of American elites. And the populism is still running through its core, running through the veins of our body politic these days. And one of the things that populism does is it doesn't like things like free trade. It doesn't like the idea of competitive economic systems. It turns everybody into an identity politics group, beseeching their relative representatives in power for their goodies, and they don't really care about what it does to undermine the whole of the system.
I know we're up against time here, and I know, Neil, you have to go. Let me just finish on this. And it's kind of a where do we go from here, because I think diagnosing the problem is pretty easy. But you said in your essay a line that really jumped out at me. And you wrote, "Little did anyone suspect that we would end up being as degenerate as the Soviets." It seems to be a rather large problem if America is suffering from a degeneracy problem. I mean, how does one address that? The war on drugs, obviously, was a pretty big failure in my estimation. And, go back to LBJ and the Great Society, throwing money at problems hasn't really corrected it. And as Jonah points out, technology has changed things in a significant way. People are living on their phones. It's a different universe. How does one go forward here if the problem with the United States is one of a culture and a society that's become, in your words, degenerate?
Yeah, that was the word I used when I wrote The Great Degeneration. I think it captures very well the kind of things we began by talking about. The severe declines in life expectancy, quality of life, public health, and the crisis of morale, this belief that the institutions are rotten. Now, Jonah, I have a better solution, an easier solution for you. Just move to Switzerland, because Switzerland's the only advanced democracy that has maintained decentralization and has not succumbed to the French disease that all power ends up in the capital, as Tocqueville described it. Turning the United States into Switzerland is an admirable project, but it's almost certain to fail. And it's certain to fail because of the problem that nearly all republics run into eventually. And that problem is the one that Jonah brilliantly characterized, where the populists of the left and the populists of the right agree that the rule of law and the Constitution and free trade are all actually a sham. and it would be much easier to have a king, really, on reflection. What's interesting about what happens after the Soviet collapse is that there's this Weimar period in the 1990s. I remember it vividly. And then Putin appears. I wrote an essay in 2000, 24 years ago, with the title Weimar on the Volga, in which I and Brigitte Gronville said, after Weimar, nothing is more predictable than the advent of a fascist regime. That's what's happened in Russia. And our great nightmare in the United States is that we end up in some version of that classic Republican crisis, the classic thing that claimed every republic in history up until the foundation of the United States was that at some point there's an alliance between the demagogues, the plebs, against the elites and the Constitution. And that's a much more common outcome than the unique example of Switzerland, which has retained the decentralization or subsidiarity principle in its governance. There's no other example but Switzerland. So I fear that we're closer to the Soviet Union than we are to Switzerland. That's the trouble with Jonah's vision. It would be wonderful if we could turn the United States into Switzerland, but we're not going to.
And I would just say the reason why, among the reasons why I think the Soviet framing distorts more than it reveals is that the Soviet Union was never a republic. It never had a republican tradition, even never really had a lasting liberal tradition that endured, or democratic tradition that endured for maybe a year, 2 years. When we can talk about the erosion of American institutions, and that's a real problem, loss in faith and trust in institutions, loss in faith and trust in our leaders, loss of the erosion of religion in people's lives. These are very, very serious problems. They were not the Soviet problems. The Soviet Union did not have institutions to decay. The Soviet Union, borrowing from what Karl Friedrich and Zbigniew Brzezinski in their book on totalitarianism, had purged the society entirely of islands of separateness. Their term for the mediating institutions that gave sort of the ecosystem, that give the Burkean little platoons that give the ecosystem of civil society contour and richness. That had all been cleansed away. And so, again, as a matter of historical analysis, to say that America is becoming like the Soviet Union when we didn't start out like the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union didn't start out like us, I don't know if that's particularly helpful. I think,
well, from a monarchist perspective, Jonah, both of these revolutionary republics began with the same act of overthrowing monarchical government. And it's just that one republic went down one path using the Enlightenment handbooks of the late 18th century, and then the other, the Russian, went down a different path with the Marxism handbook of the mid-19th century. But it was a union of Soviet socialist republics. They were republics.
Yeah, no, they had the name republic in them. They weren't republics. And it was like the North Korea is not a democratic republic just because it uses the name. Russia did not have any tradition of civil society of the likes that Western Europe had, and the flowing of Tsarism to Bolshevism makes a lot of sense from the long sweep of history. I would argue you poo-pooed my point in my response on Twitter, but I stand by it 100%. That nothing. The way to understand why the Soviet thing, I think, just doesn't work is that if the Soviet Union in the 1980s went back to basics and redoubled on its founding principles, it would have died quicker. If the United States went back to its founding principles and restored them, it would fix a lot of the problems that we have. And that is just, those are just very different things. And it gets to the point that, look, do we have real problems? Yeah. Do they need addressing? Absolutely. But this is a good and decent country with immense resources that the Soviet Union never had. Immense resources that the Soviet Union never had. And we can draw on the moral capital and the decency of the American character in ways, and the benefits of a free market system for all of its limitations that are being imposed on it by statists, in ways to respond to our problems that the Soviet Union could not. And I share with you the desire to arouse the desire in the American people to start that project. I don't know saying we are doomed to fail the way the Soviet Union did is the way to do it.
I'm the last person to be accused of determinism. I wrote a book called Doomed to Make Fun of Determinism. I think that this is a debate not about origins. This is a debate about destinations. And the problem is that the destination seems to me much less likely to be Switzerland or some version of Tocqueville's America that you're imagining, a kind of rebirth of the Republic, than it seems to me to be a quintessential late Soviet, late Republic crisis in which the constitutional and liberal order simply doesn't hold. But it's not too late. And you and I, Jonah, we're going to make common cause from now on to fight for those principles that we both believe in. We have different rhetorical approaches, but we have the same shared vision of an America restored to founding principles in which individual liberty is at the core of the enterprise. So we don't disagree about that objective. I'm just a wee bit
We're in violent
pessimistic.
agreement about that.
We're in violent agreement about that. And I'm just a wee bit more pessimistic about our chances of success.
Niall Ferguson, newly minted columnist over at the Free Press. Read We Are All Soviets now at the FP.com, and a number of columns to come, which will surely irritate Jonah Goldberg at the
Probably
Dispatch.
not.
And the man behind the brilliant podcast. Yeah. And listen to Jonah at The Remnant, a podcast that I love. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.